I want to invite you to turn to Exodus chapter 24. This 24th chapter of the book of Exodus is perhaps not exactly what one might have expected as one of our passages that we would look at summarize the Old Testament. It is, I believe, of extraordinary importance. Now, let me set the context for you just momentarily. Last Sunday night, we looked at Exodus chapters 19 and 20. In Exodus chapter 19, the children of Israel, having come out of Egypt, arrived down at Mount Sinai. God told them that He was going to take them to be His own special possession, His own special people, His nation above all other nations. Then we looked at Exodus chapter 20 especially, and the Ten Commandments that were given there. And of course, after God spoke the Ten Commandments in the hearing of Israel, the children of Israel said to Moses, "Let not God speak with us any longer, lest we die." But rather, they asked that Moses would be their intercessor, that God would speak with Moses, and Moses would relay the word of God to the children of Israel. And God commended them, and Moses commended them for that. And so, in the next few chapters, Moses went up onto Mount Sinai and received the law, something larger than the Ten Commandments, a section of the law that is called later on the Book of the Covenant. It consists of Exodus chapters 21, 22, and 23. And then he came down from Mount Sinai, having spent 40 days up there. He came back down off of Mount Sinai to communicate those laws to the children of Israel. And that really is where we pick up in Exodus chapter 24, and starting really in verse 3. It says, "Then Moses came down from Mount Sinai at the end of the 40 days, and recounted to the people all of the words of the Lord, and all of the ordinances, and all the people answered with one voice and said, 'All the words which the Lord has spoken, we will do.'" Now we're going to read some more verses here, but as we start to read these verses, I want you to ask yourself, what is happening here? I mean, if you just had to pick out some sort of single word or single phrase or expression to describe what is happening in this 24th chapter of Exodus, what would you say is going on right here? Because I think we're going to discover it is of very special importance. So he comes down and he tells them all those laws that God had given him up there on Mount Sinai, the ones recorded in the preceding chapters. And they said, "All that God has spoken we will do." And so in verse 4 it says, Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. Then he rose early in the morning, and he built an altar at the foot of the mountain with 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, he tells them all this law. Then after he tells them all of it by word of mouth, he writes it all down that night. And the next morning they get up and they build an altar, and they set up these 12 pillars, probably standing stones that would represent each of the 12 tribes that were gathered there. And then, in verse 5 it says, "He sent young men of the sons of Israel, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as peace offerings." So they start offering sacrifices. And they take some of the blood in verse 6. Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins. And the other half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. They collect the blood from this animal that is sacrificed here. And, you know, as we look at it, we might say, boy, this is kind of strange. It probably wasn't as strange to them as it would seem to us. It probably was more obvious to them what they were doing than it is immediately to us. But they take that blood and they take half of it and sprinkle it on the people. Now, I don't know how many people actually got sprinkled. There were a couple of million of them altogether. But I suspect it was probably representatives from each of the 12 tribes. And they take the other half and they put it there, sprinkle that at the base of the altar. And then he took the book of the covenant. Those basically chapters 21, 22, and 23, the three preceding chapters, the laws that God had given him up there on the mountain during the preceding 40 days. The laws that he'd already told them what all those were when he got back down the previous day. But last night he'd written them all down. And so now he gets up and he reads them all to them. So for a second time now they hear all of these laws. And so he reads all of the law, and once again, says, they said, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do and be obedient." And so he took the blood and sprinkled it on the people. And he said, Behold, the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. Now, pause right there. What's happening right here? On one level, we can just go back and kind of describe what we saw. Well, they killed some oxen and they read the law, and people said they would keep it, and they sprinkled some of the blood on the people and some on the altar. Yeah, but in a word, what is really going on right here? This, friends, is where the Old Testament is actually made, what we call the Old Covenant. In other words, we say there's the Old Testament and there's the New Testament. And we talk about how the New Testament was brought into effect by the sacrifice of Christ. And his sacrifice not only brought forgiveness of sins, but it was also the covenant sacrifice. And so we point to those passages in the New Testament that describe the crucifixion of Christ and his sacrifice, and we say, here the new covenant is made and the new covenant comes into effect. Well, what happens right here in Exodus chapter 24, this is where the children of Israel actually enter into a covenant relationship with God. A covenant, well, we don't use that term a whole lot nowadays. It's another term really for a treaty. We use the term treaty almost exclusively of arrangements between nations nowadays, not much of private contracts or something of that nature. If you do want to find the word covenant, look at some legal things. If you ever took out a mortgage on a house, you'd probably find the word covenant scattered all through the language there. It's talking about two people entering into a binding agreement. And that's exactly what the Old Testament was. God and the children of Israel entered into a covenant, an agreement with each other. And this is where they actually become his people in fulfillment of the promise that he had made to them, in fulfillment of what he said. He brought them down here to Mount Sinai for, that they should be his people out of all the nations of the earth. And it is a blood covenant. It is ratified by the sacrifice and by the application of the blood of that animal that was sacrificed. And it has terms to it. And the terms of that covenant are those laws that God had given the children of Israel. And that's why Moses made sure they understood what the law was. First of all, he told them what it was. And they said, yep, we'll agree to that. They agreed to the terms of the covenant. And then just to make sure, the next day after he's written it all down, when you have a covenant, you have to have written copies, of what you do. These are the terms, and here's our permanent record of, what we've agreed to here. Well, he writes it all down, and then he comes back to them the next day, and he reads it all. And once again, they say, yep, we'll do it. We accept the terms. We will do these things. And so with that, they complete the ceremony by sprinkling the blood as appropriate. And what's happening? It is a covenant between God and Israel. And that is why as they sprinkle the blood, and part of the blood is sprinkled on the people, they're one party to the covenant. And of course, they can't really sprinkle the blood on God. But what do? They sprinkle it on the altar. That's God's altar where sacrifices are made, and that altar represents his presence there. I think probably they even understood that the fire of the altar represented God's presence there among them. And so it is a covenant between God and Israel. We talk about when does the New Testament come into effect. We say with the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. Well, when did the Old Testament come into effect? Right here in Exodus chapter 24.